Imagine diving hundreds of feet below the Atlantic. There's no sunlight, only darkness, pressure, and cold silence. Then, out of nowhere, you see it. Towers of glowing white coral rising from the black. It's called the HookLine Bank, and it exists nowhere else on Earth. For decades, scientists thought they had saved it, sealed off from destruction, protected forever. But now, that protection is on the line again. Federal officials are considering reopening parts of this rare deep-water reef to commercial shrimp trawling. A move scientists warn could wipe it out for good. How does something this rare, this fragile, end up in danger again? And why are people fighting to reopen an area that was once declared dead, only to find new life slowly returning? Today, we're diving deep into the hidden world beneath Florida's coast, to uncover how a reef that survived one destruction could face another. Because sometimes, the most important battles for Florida's future are the ones happening out of sight and out of mind. About 15 miles off the coast of Fort Pierce, Florida, lies a place most Floridians have never heard of. Yet it's one of the rarest ecosystems on the planet. It's called the HookLine Bank, a massive 300-square-mile coral reef that stretches deep below the surface, between 200 and 300 feet down. Unlike most coral reefs that depend on sunlight and warm, shallow water, this one thrives in near darkness. It's built from a species called HookLine varicosa, a white, branching coral that glows like bone under deep-sea lights. When scientists first discovered it in the 1970s, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. An underwater forest growing in total darkness, teeming with life. Schools of snapper and grouper darted between coral towers that reached 50 feet high. Sponges, shrimp, crabs, thousands of species found shelter there. It was quickly labeled a national treasure, a habitat area of particular concern. But not long after its discovery, the HookLine Bank would face the same threat that has destroyed so many Florida habitats: human pressure and profit. Because beneath its beauty, a silent battle was already beginning. Most coral reefs need sunlight. They grow in clear, shallow water where the sun fuels microscopic algae that keep them alive. But the HookLine Bank breaks every rule of biology. It thrives in the dark, 200 to 300 feet below the surface, in cold, high-pressure water where no sunlight reaches. Down there, the coral doesn't rely on light at all. Instead, it feeds by capturing tiny drifting organisms, building massive structures that rise like ghostly towers from the sea floor. Marine biologist Dr. Grant Gilmore described the site as breathtaking. He once dove the reef in a submersible and saw coral spires 50 feet tall, stretching as far as his lights could reach. "It's extremely unique," he said. "That species only exists here, nowhere else on Earth." Imagine a white mountain range hidden beneath the ocean, glowing in the beam of a diver's lamp, surrounded by clouds of fish. That's the HookLine Bank, a world few will ever see, yet one that quietly sustains much of Florida's ocean life. Fish like snapper and grouper, which drive both commercial and recreational fishing across the state, spawn and feed here. This deepwater coral acts as their nursery, protecting young fish before they migrate to the shallows. For decades, scientists believed this ecosystem had found its balance, a hidden stronghold where life thrived beyond human reach. But that illusion didn't last long. By the 1980s, the same industrial fishing gear that powered Florida's seafood industry began creeping into those depths. And what happened next turned one of Earth's rarest coral systems into a graveyard of rubble. By the early 1980s, commercial shrimping had exploded along Florida's east coast. Fishermen used trawl nets, massive, heavy gear dragged across the ocean floor to scoop up shrimp by the ton. But those same nets didn't just catch shrimp. They caught everything. The HookLine Bank sat right in their path. Each drag of a net was like bulldozing a forest, crushing coral that had taken hundreds of years to grow. When scientists returned to study the reef, what they found was devastating. Almost 90% of the coral had been destroyed. What once looked like an underwater city was now a wasteland of rubble and broken skeletons. Marine scientist Dr. Grant Gilmore still remembers those dives. He said, "You can see the scars on the bottom, the otter doors, the nets, the lines that snapped and sank. It's just rubble." For many, it was a gut punch. Proof that even the deepest, most remote ecosystems weren't safe from human impact. The Oculina Bank had been discovered in 1975. Less than 10 years later, it was almost gone. By the early 2000s, researchers described it as a shadow of what it once was. An underwater graveyard filled with the remains of coral that had stood for centuries. That destruction triggered one of the first major wake-up calls for ocean conservation in America. Scientists and advocates began demanding action, arguing that the reef wasn't just a coral garden, but a vital nursery for the fish that feed Florida's entire fishing economy. And after years of petitions and hearings, the government finally responded, creating something that had never existed before: a marine protected area, designed to give a dying reef a chance to live again. In 1994, the United States took an unprecedented step. For the first time in the nation's history, a stretch of ocean floor was declared a marine protected area, and it was centered right over the Oculina Bank. The new rules banned trawling across 1/3 of the reef, creating a sanctuary where corals could finally breathe again. Over the next decade, those protections expanded to cover most of the reef, and this time, the closure became permanent. It was a major victory for scientists who had spent years documenting the destruction, and slowly signs of life began to return. Divers and submersibles spotted new coral sprouts clinging to fragments of the old reef. Juvenile fish were back: snapper, grouper, and hundreds of smaller species using the coral rubble as shelter. For a moment, it felt like a miracle. The Oculina Bank was proof that nature, when given a little time and space, could heal itself. Researchers began calling it the comeback reef, a symbol of what smart protection could achieve. But that optimism came with a warning. Deepwater corals grow painfully slow, sometimes less than a centimeter per year. What had been destroyed in one decade could take centuries to fully recover. So when scientists heard the reef might be reopened to trawling again, their reaction was disbelief. How could we risk repeating the same mistake, knowing how long it takes for this ecosystem to heal? The Oculina Bank had already been destroyed once. Now it faced the unthinkable: a second chance on the brink of being taken away. 3 decades after the Oculina Bank was protected, a new proposal surfaced. One that could change everything again. The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, the federal group that oversees fisheries in the region, introduced 2 amendments this year. Both would reopen parts of the Oculina Bank to shrimp trawling, an activity that had been banned for decades. To many, it sounded like déjà vu, the same story playing out all over again. But this time, the argument wasn't about ignoring science. It was about survival. Shrimpers say their industry is collapsing. Data from the council shows that rock shrimp trips dropped from over 700 per year in the mid-1990s to fewer than 100 since 2010. The number of active boats has fallen from 144 to barely a dozen. Shrimpers blame high fuel costs, imported seafood, and new restrictions that keep them from traditional fishing grounds. Even space launches off Cape Canaveral have become a challenge, closing ocean access zones nearly 50 times a year for safety. To them, reopening a small part of the reef could mean survival. As one industry leader put it, every little bit helps. But for scientists, those few reopened miles could undo decades of recovery. Shrimp trawling doesn't just scrape the bottom. It stirs up massive plumes of sediment that drift for miles. And if those clouds settle over live coral, they can smother it completely. That's why biologists like Dr. Edie Witter say the ecological cost far outweighs the economic benefit. The rock shrimp fishery is a niche market, she explained. It's tiny compared to Florida's overall fishery. In 2023, shrimp from that area brought in around $1 million. But the fish species that depend on the reef, like snapper and grouper, generated nearly $300 million statewide. And that's the heart of the debate. Can Florida afford to sacrifice an irreplaceable reef to save an industry that barely exists anymore? At first glance, this might sound like just another policy debate. Science versus industry. Economy versus environment. But beneath the surface, it's something deeper. The HookLine Bank isn't just a coral reef. It's a foundation, a living structure that keeps Florida's ocean life in balance. Snapper, grouper, and dozens of other commercial fish species spawn and feed here before making their way into the fisheries that feed people across the state. If that nursery is damaged again, the ripple effect could stretch all the way to your dinner plate and to the livelihoods of thousands of Floridians who depend on healthy fish populations. Scientists warn that reopening even a small area could unleash sediment clouds that drift across the reef, choking coral and destroying habitats for miles. And once that happens, there's no coming back. The numbers make it clear. In 2023, the rock shrimp industry brought in about $1 million nationwide. Meanwhile, Florida's reef-dependent fisheries, the ones that rely on these spawning grounds, generated nearly $300 million. That's a 300-to-1 difference. So even on a purely economic level, protecting the reef just makes sense. But this isn't only about money. It's about time, and whether we've learned from history. Because if the reef dies again, it won't take decades to recover. It'll take centuries. The ocean remembers every scar we leave behind, and the HookLine Bank already carries too many of them. When the proposal to reopen parts of the HookLine Bank went public, people from across the country responded. More than 150 public comments poured into the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and the message was overwhelming. About 120 people opposed the plan, while just 25 supported it. Among those in favor were shrimpers fighting to stay afloat, but the vast majority, divers, scientists, conservation groups, and everyday Floridians, spoke out against it. They weren't just fighting for coral, they were fighting for legacy, for the idea that some places are worth protecting even if we never see them. Many locals pointed out that parts of the proposed trawling zones still contain living coral and fish nurseries. Even NOAA's own mapping warned that sediment from trawling could drift into the reef and smother fragile ecosystems. As one advocate put it, it's the nursery for our future fish. We're risking covering it with clouds of mud just to chase a few shrimp. Another added, they think they can control those nets, but they've never seen what those sediment plumes really look like. It's rare to see so many Floridians united on an issue like this, but when it comes to the ocean, the state's lifeblood, the message is clear. The people want the reef protected, because if it's gone again, it's gone forever. The story of the HookLine Bank isn't just about coral. It's about what happens when something extraordinary hides too far below the surface for most people to notice. For years, scientists believed the reef had been saved, a symbol of how humans could correct their mistakes. But now, it stands as a reminder of how fragile those victories really are. The phrase scientists keep repeating is simple: out of sight, out of mind. Because when something isn't visible, it's easy to forget how much it matters. The HookLine Bank may never be a tourist attraction. You can't snorkel there or post it on Instagram. But it's part of what keeps Florida's coast alive, the unseen engine that powers an entire ecosystem. So the question becomes, Do we value what we can't see? Or do we only protect what's profitable in the moment? The reef can't fight for itself. It can't protest or speak. But the people who depend on it, and the future that relies on it, can. If this reef disappears again, there won't be a third chance. The Oculina Bank has already survived one near extinction. Whether it gets to survive again depends on what happens next, and on who's paying attention. Florida's reefs are more than scenery. They're the lungs of the ocean, the foundation of entire fisheries, and the legacy we leave behind. If you believe places like this deserve a voice, share this story. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into Florida's hidden waters. Because the fight for the ocean's future doesn't start in Washington. It starts right here, with awareness.